Hey everyone, as you all know, I enjoy debunking charlatans more than just about anything else, and today we have a 2-for-1. We will be looking at Bret and Eric Weinstein, the self-appointed leaders of the intellectual dark web. I've never debunked brothers before, so let's have some fun with it. Again, in case you've never heard the term before, these guys are prominent members of the so-called intellectual dark web, the term actually having been coined by Eric himself.
The group of people I'm increasingly hanging out with is the intellectual dark web, which is emerging.
The dark web, of course, being the place where people hire hitmen and watch kiddie porn, so it's not really the most sparkling connotation. But the deeper down the rabbit hole you go with these two, the seedier and more repulsive they seem, so it is quite fitting. Now, if you've seen some of my recent debunks on Terrence Howard, you've heard me talk about Eric a bit already. Well, there's a lot more to discuss here today, including a special guest to help me debunk his theory of geometric unity. But let's start with younger brother Bret, and then pivot to big boy Eric after that. Bret has a doctorate in evolutionary biology and taught at Evergreen State College for 15 years. He was catapulted to prominence in 2017 due to an incident on campus. Here's the popular version of the story. A protest had been held every year called Day of Absence, where minority students and faculty stayed off campus to make a statement about racial issues. In 2017, it was requested that white students and faculty leave campus instead for that year's Day of Absence. Bret vocally protested this idea, saying that you can't force people off campus just for being white. As a result, liberal SJW students threatened Bret with baseball bats, the media erupted with a story about reverse racism, and Bret became a hero overnight by standing up for marginalized white people everywhere. Of course, the reality is totally different. The Day of Absence had always been a voluntary activity where all students could attend workshops and discussions of their choosing, and this year was no different. It was simply that the locations of these discussions had changed, with the off-campus site only able to accommodate 200 people, making it obvious that it was not expected for all white students to attend, nor had all of the minority students participated in the past. None of it had ever been school-sanctioned, nobody was coercing white people off campus or making them feel unwelcome, and nobody threatened Bret with baseball bats. Bret totally exaggerated these events in his own correspondence, distorted the context surrounding those who were protesting a full 6 weeks after the Day of Absence regarding separate campus events, and instead went on Fox News with Tucker Carlson to play the victim in a story that reeks of the exact same vibe as the War on Christmas.
This year, student activists demanded that all white people leave campus or else. Oh my gosh, this is like something out of another country.
Because of the Fox piece, enraged neo-Nazi group Atomwaffen descended onto the campus, repeatedly driving by and shooting guns into the air, sending in bomb threats, and as a result, the school's graduation had to be moved off-site due to safety concerns. Bret sued the school for $3.8 million, settled for $500,000 and his resignation, and promptly began his career as a podcaster and darling of the right.
I'm troubled by what this implies about the current state of the left.
Whoa, you think? Whoa, you think?
You think?
Where else have we seen this story before? Yes, Jordan Peterson, frustrated academic taking a stand against PC culture, cartoonishly fabricating the implications of Bill C-16 to manufacture some kind of authoritarianism to rage against, leveraging the blowback and riding the conservative news cycle to launch himself towards a lucrative commentating career, hiding behind a false flag of free speech absolutism. It's all here, beat for beat. Bret, like Jordan, played the reluctant martyr and victim of nasty liberal academia, knowing full well that he was distorting the facts, putting students and faculty in real physical danger, many of whom were targeted with harassment and death threats from white nationalists, and he did it all anyway. He allowed Tucker to state that white people were being forced off campus, which was a lie.
The core demand is that all people of your skin color leave the campus.
He pretended protests were all about a leaked email of his, rather than about the treatment of 2 black students by campus police and other social issues, which was a lie, and he kept amplifying these lies on Twitter well after the interview. Thus begins the story of Bret Weinstein, a demagogue from the start, stoking the fires of anti-woke conservative hatred for personal gain with no remorse whatsoever. Now on to the actual science denial, since that's the real focus here. During and shortly following his departure from academia, Bret gained notoriety through a series of appearances on, where the hell else, Joe Rogan's podcast. Having his web presence sufficiently amplified by these appearances enabled him to monetize something of his own, so Bret began dishing out consistently garbage conspiratorial takes about everything under the sun on his own Dark Horse podcast that he hosts with his wife Heather Haying, who also taught biology at Evergreen. Much of their rhetoric capitalizes on a perceived intellectualization of baseless anti-establishment talking points, which we will highlight where relevant. So what are the main topics he needs to be exposed for? Here's what's on the menu for the Bret half of the video. First up, Bret's attempt at revolutionizing all of medical science. According to Bret, and also his brother Eric, Bret had an astounding insight about telomeres that was stolen from him to win a Nobel Prize. To get some context, let's first briefly discuss what telomeres are. Telomeres are sections of DNA that cap every chromosome in almost all animal species. The evolutionary impetus for this is that every time DNA gets replicated prior to cell division, because of the way that replicative enzymes anneal to the template strand, the last few bases can't be read. So the new complementary strand is necessarily a few dozen nucleotides shorter than the template strand. This poses an obvious problem because as incredibly long as chromosomes are, with many millions of base pairs, thousands of cycles of replication and cell division would eventually result in important genetic information being lost, and therefore new cells that can't survive. Evolution stumbled upon a solution in the form of telomeres, which are around 5 to 15,000 base pairs long. The purpose of them is simply to act as long stretches of repetitive non-coding DNA at the ends of each chromosome, so that nothing bad happens as the tips are continually eroded during replication, and an enzyme called telomerase, when expressed, is constantly at work adding more nucleotides to the ends of each strand, to keep the telomeres intact as long as possible. If the telomeres are lost completely, further replication can begin to erode actual coding DNA. All kinds of problems occur, and this is called senescence. Okay, so that's what telomeres are. What's Bret's big groundbreaking discovery?
We actually have a kind of concern about pharmaceuticals very generally, and this arises from the fact that in my graduate work, as many of you who are longtime fans of the podcast will know, my graduate work, I happened onto what I believe is a flaw in the drug safety system. I published this flaw, and the flaw basically amounts to the mice that are often used for things like drug safety testing and other experiments having been accidentally evolutionarily modified by the breeding protocol that is used to produce them, so that their telomeres, which are these repetitive sequences at the ends of chromosomes, have been elongated tremendously, and this has potentially very large impacts. Effectively, these animals have a capacity to repair their tissues so that if you poison them, but you don't outright kill them, they actually have an extremely good capacity to fix themselves, whereas we have a limited capacity. So they're bad models.
Yep, Bret says that because lab mice have longer telomeres than wild mice, all the drug testing on them is invalid, and all the drugs in the world are potentially dangerous. There is so much stupidity to unpack here. First, and the most glaringly obvious problem with this logic, is that all drugs go through clinical trials on human subjects before going to market. So it's mice first, then other non-rodent animal species, then humans, prior to going to market, always. This fact alone renders this entire idea irrelevant and idiotic. We know what drugs do to people before people can buy them. So even if lab mice were somehow more resistant to some toxicity, we would catch it in other test subjects. Second, telomere length is just barely even relevant to what Bret is talking about. He's talking about toxicity and tissue repair. All telomeres do is prolong the duration of time that cell division can occur prior to the onset of senescence. They aren't some magic shield from every kind of deleterious biological process. Telomere shortening isn't even the only cause of senescence. Telomere length also does not correlate linearly with lifespan. Mice have longer telomeres than humans do, and we live way longer than them. And lab mice don't have uniquely long telomeres in the first place. Other species have longer ones. But most importantly, as any biologist knows, tissue degradation occurs via so many different mechanisms, given that there are so many types of tissues, from neural tissue to muscular tissue and so forth, all of this having indeed very little to do with telomeres. Telomere length does not have any impact on gene expression, its products, or its regulation, nor how toxic agents interact with the products of gene expression. A toxin that inhibits enzymatic function is not magically neutralized by telomeres. Telomeres are relevant to studies on aging and also certain kinds of cancers, but that's about it. This whole thing is just an erroneous observation extrapolated to something totally baseless, drenched in anti-pharma sentiment. It gets much worse, though. Bret pretends that this absolute nothing burger of a scientific claim was so astonishing that it was suppressed by the establishment and then subsequently stolen by a prominent researcher who used it to earn her Nobel Prize. Bret likes to retain a facade of humility whenever possible, so he needs his big brother to take the reins with this accusation, as well as generally painting Bret as some kind of mythical hero genius, and Eric does not disappoint.
In Bret's case, you probably know him, if you know him at all, as the heroic professor who stood up against what can only be described, and I swear I'm not making this up, as a Maoist insurrection at an American college in the Pacific Northwest, the Evergreen State College.
Yes, he swears he's not making up the dumb thing he made up. A Maoist insurrection. Maoism, of course, being a form of communism marked by armed insurgency. The students at Evergreen were total Maoists, with the way they had to hide in their dorms from actually armed neo-Nazis that Bret invited to their campus with his Tucker Carlson appearance. Good God, what a pretentious douchebag.
Part of it, what happened is that you are now distorting the history of science. You have a place in the history of science that you are not taking up, you are not advocating for. There's something that you don't like about this.
Well, that's laughable. Bret has published 2 papers. He's contributed essentially nothing to the field of biology. He was a teacher. But this is Eric's favorite story to tell, about his brother and himself, the revolutionary geniuses who got unfairly swept under the rug.
I know that it happened, and I know that it got buried.
Yep.
And I know that it's part of what I'm calling the distributed idea suppression complex, because quite frankly, you were not the only person who was a part of this story.
Gee, can you guess who else Eric is referring to? These 2 are absolutely shameless. Speaking of which, here comes the shameless accusation. For context, Carol Greider is a molecular biologist who discovered telomerase as a grad student in the 80s and in general pioneered much of the early research on telomeres.
Carol, we are stunned to find that our paper was turned away without review from Nature.
Without review.
Without review. We need your help. Can I send you the paper and have you look at it? And she says yes. And I send her the paper. And she sends back the paper with an unbelievable number of intense criticisms that are not sensible.
Not sensible, which is code for Carol explaining to Bret how his paper sucks and him not wanting to accept reality. You can see for yourself on his paper, published in 2002, where he asserts that telomere shortening is responsible for all tissue degradation, ignoring that there are hundreds of tissue types, each with their own aging dynamic. This is why when Experimental Gerontology sent the paper to Carol to review, she panned it again.
She was in line for a Nobel Prize. That was well understood. I didn't want to accuse a leading light of the field of
Okay, this is exactly why I got angry at you at the beginning of the podcast, you moron. No offense. You were in line for a Nobel Prize.
Does Eric think they give away Nobel Prizes like class participation trophies? The guy is beyond delusional. Carol discovered telomerase and is the primary pioneer of telomere research in general. Bret is a nobody who did nothing. Oh, what if this thing in mice is not something you get a Nobel for, and it has nothing to do with what Carol got hers for? Insanity.
I contact her, and I discover, through talking to her, that she and Mike are about to publish their paper on the long telomeres of laboratory mice.
So this is the delta between wild type and laboratory mice.
Yeah. And I'm shocked because she's told me they're keeping it in-house. I'm disturbed. This was my hypothesis that you were testing. I should probably be an author on this paper, but at the very least, I need to be an acknowledgement in this paper so that I can go back and point to it and say
It changes everything, that it was a prediction. It wasn't just something that was stumbled upon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, Bret is accusing Carroll of stealing his work that was published in 2002, when in fact Carroll published a paper on varying telomere length in mice in 2000 and even alluded to it in another paper in 1995. Whoops.
Awarded the Nobel Prize. Carroll, Greider, Elizabeth Blackburn, and Shostak. What Carroll Greider does with her Nobel lecture, right? Nobel lecture being the biggest lecture a scientist will ever give, the lecture that...
And filmed,
is she delivers a paper in which she very oddly has now embraced my entire set of hypotheses about the effect. She has come over from the comparison between the paper of mine that she panned and said didn't make any sense. She is now a total convert to the idea that senescence across the body is being caused by Hayflick limits that are telomere-based.
Okay, and
Bret outs himself here. He backpedals from tissue degradation and all kinds of other unfounded claims to connections between telomeres and senescence, which nobody disputes and were already well known. This is what frauds do. They make bold, sweeping claims using specific keywords, and then they rein in these claims to reference established science with the same keywords in order to pretend that it vindicates them. The electric universe grifters use this playbook when they make up bullshit about electricity powering the galaxy and then point at Birkeland currents as though they substantiate any of the bullshit they spew. As anyone can plainly see, this narrative attracts the people that it attracts because of the anti-establishment sentiment. These podcast episodes are littered with comments from people praising Bret for his unparalleled brilliance just because he says a bunch of words they don't understand. It's ridiculous. Do they look for interviews with actual accomplished scientists and dish out the same type of praise? Were they dropping praise on Carroll Greider when she got the Nobel? Of course not. They have no interest in following scientific research, and they have no idea what Bret is saying when he references scientific concepts. The allure is not any kind of alleged scientific achievement. It's the story of the underdog, the one who got screwed over by the system, and the corrupt bureaucracies behind it all. That's why people are here, and that's the only story the Weinsteins know how to tell. This tale continues for Bret, as it did for most of the science-denying charlatans who are popular today, with the onset of the COVID pandemic. There are three primary narratives he pushed relentlessly in this realm. The first was a cartoonish level of confidence in the lab leak hypothesis with absolutely zero evidence. The second was being one of the main players in pushing ivermectin as some kind of preventive measure for COVID, again with zero basis. And the third was jumping on the bandwagon of fabricating millions of deaths from COVID vaccines. Let's take these one at a time. Since the emergence of the novel coronavirus from China in 2019, plenty of conspiracy theories have circulated as to its origin, contradicting the widely proposed zoonotic origin, meaning arising naturally in animal populations, in this case bats, and developing virulence in humans through natural evolutionary processes, likely after passing through some intermediate species such as pangolins. The more outlandish of these ideas involved the notion that China deliberately created SARS coronavirus 2 as a bioweapon and released it on the world intentionally, something that has been quite thoroughly refuted via genomic analysis, which would require a whole video unto itself to explain. Far less conspiratorial was the notion that the virus accidentally leaked from a lab in Wuhan. As early as June 2020, Bret was on the record saying he was 90% sure this was the case.
And that theory was demonized at first, that, oh, it can't, that, come on, that's conspiracy thinking, that it would start it in the lab. But it certainly is a 50-50, would you say that?
Oh, it's far more likely than that. As a matter of fact,
Right.
I said, I think in June, that the chances that it came from the lab looked to me to be about 90%.
This is already ridiculous. 90% sure based on what? A hunch? His spidey sense? He offers absolutely nothing to substantiate this, but it gets so much worse. As time passed, he began to reject any data regarding zoonotic origin as a conspiracy from the virology community. When any such papers were released, he would pretend they were government lies sent to squash the lab-leaked truth while people were distracted by the war in Ukraine. In conversation with Joe Rogan, he has said even crazier things, like that pandemics emerging from nature are nothing to worry about. Fatality during the Spanish flu of a century ago was due to overprescription of aspirin. He thinks polio is actually due to pesticides, and implies that most viruses are lab leaks, claiming that monkeypox shows signs of gain-of-function research. He is just completely off his rocker.
There was a enthusiasm for prescribing aspirin for people who came in with flu symptoms, and they were prescribed aspirin in doses that are now known to be deadly. Is something like an epidemic of polio that's not really an epidemic of polio. You have an epidemic of gypsy moths that are being sprayed for with these toxic pesticides. Right. It's a crazy, crazy story.
Next up, the ivermectin debacle. This incident is particularly fascinating to me. Once COVID vaccines began rolling out, anti-vaxxers were desperately looking for ways to criticize the operation and bypass the vaccines. Some suggested that ivermectin, an anti-parasitic drug, was miraculous in not just killing SARS coronavirus 2, but also in preventing infection. There is no clinical basis for this assertion, but the most hilarious aspect of this story is that it was adopted by those eager to denigrate the pharmaceutical industry for rolling out what they baselessly decided were ineffective or even harmful vaccines, meant only to make money, when ivermectin is itself a pharmaceutical drug developed initially by Merck, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. So there was not even any consistency to the narrative. Those pushing ivermectin wanted to stick it to the pharmaceutical industry by boycotting their vaccines and throwing their money at a random pharmaceutical drug. When medical professionals caught wind of the situation and tried to communicate to the public how there is no basis for presuming that ivermectin has any utility whatsoever in curing COVID or preventing its transmission, including Merck themselves, who issued this very statement, they were instantly labeled pharma shills trying to shut down the story to maintain pharma profits by people who don't even exercise their own logic to its obvious conclusion. Anyone could make the same argument for those trying to push ivermectin, a drug that would earn pharma lots of money if the whole world started taking it. It's a breathtaking example of the hypocrisy of science deniers. Never one to miss out on some good old science-based charlatanry, Joe Rogan held an emergency podcast with Bret to get the word out on ivermectin, and he continued to push it relentlessly on his own with the help of various other fraudulent guests. Bret and his wife, who, if you recall, are highly skeptical about pharmaceutical drugs because of the mouse telomere thing, took ivermectin on the air on their own podcast.
And we are a bit skeptical of pills.
A lot skeptical.
A lot skeptical of pills.
Once again, there is no evidence of any kind to suggest that this drug has any utility in curing or preventing COVID. There is also no basis to suggest that the vaccines are more dangerous than the virus, the excuse for why ivermectin was being promoted as an alternative. Bret will use garbage fake studies like this Carvalho paper riddled with typos, which claimed 100% efficacy, and when he gets called out for it, instead of admitting it's garbage, he just says it's a little sloppy. There was another large study which had to be retracted due to plagiarism and problems with the raw data. The same can be said for any other such papers, which again would require a video unto itself to elucidate, but I'll link to some resources in the description. He also still promotes a website called ivmmeta.com, which pretends to have a meta-analysis of ivermectin studies that shows it is overwhelmingly effective. In reality, it did things like multiplying together the p-values of every study, including fraudulent studies, cherry-picking endpoints, and so forth. And of course, a meta-analysis of garbage papers will provide garbage insight. It's as simple as that. Bad studies do not suddenly become sound when placed next to a bunch of other bad studies. The plural of garbage is not evidence. In general, Bret's narrative had long been, why aren't they running trials on this? And once large clinical trials were being done on ivermectin, proving that it isn't effective, he just came up with conspiratorial reasons to dismiss every single one of them. But dodging and lying about clinical data aside, the things Bret says to justify his position from the standpoint of biology are just laughably stupid. On his podcast, he says this:
The fact that the drug in question, ivermectin, comes from soil bacteria, it's not a completely synthetic molecule, means that it is likely to be similar to things that one's ancestors have encountered before, and there's therefore a good chance that the body has a reasonably elegant way of dealing with it rather than using some mechanism that's not so great.
Bret is clearly just taking advantage of negative connotations among the public surrounding the word synthetic. Whether a drug is synthetic or naturally occurring is totally meaningless. Soil bacteria produce toxins that can kill thousands of humans per milligram. Anthrax, the Clostridium tetani toxin, which causes tetanus, or the Clostridium botulinum toxin, which is the single most toxic compound known to mankind. Only the science-illiterate sector of the public thinks that natural equals good and synthetic equals bad. Any scientist knows better, but Bret isn't a scientist, and he's deliberately manipulating the public, so this is what he goes with. That a molecule never existed until humans made it does not tell us anything about toxicity, and naturally occurring compounds can be made synthetically, and they are indistinguishable. In the end, this is all just clickbait for anti-vaxxers, which exacerbates vaccine hesitancy, which in turn gets people killed. Lots of people who listened to Bret avoided getting vaccinated and died of COVID. This includes one very public case of a guy named Leslie Lawrenson, who was extremely vocal about avoiding the vaccine, repeatedly citing Bret's content as the basis for his reasoning. But undoubtedly, there were countless more. This is the point. Bret's combination of incompetence and confidence results in measurable deaths. It could be considered criminal behavior. He is not just responsible for the deaths that can be directly attributed to his rhetoric, but for so many others that resulted from new strains that were able to emerge because of the enormous host pool available to the novel coronavirus due to having access to so many unvaccinated people. This alone makes Bret a garbage person. Why do so many people fall for these lies? It's about the way they're packaged. He knows how to dish out the conspiratorial overtones people are looking for while simultaneously shielding himself from all reasonable criticism. He can't argue with the fact that all research on ivermectin shows no efficacy on COVID, so clinical trials must have been fake.
Something is engineering the appearance of X, Y, and Z. In other words, there's a price point. If you want something to be a fact, ivermectin doesn't work. You want that to be a fact? That's going to cost you. It can be a fact, but it's going to cost you.
Ivermectin was suppressed so Pfizer could make money.
By not doing the relevant large-scale clinical studies on ivermectin, and thus it not being approved by the FDA for use in COVID, that opens the door for EUAs, for emergency use authorization, for the vaccines that we are now all living with and among.
There is zero epistemological consistency to any of this. When Bret wants to pretend his conjecture is supported by data, he references any study he wants and distorts it to pretend it supports the thing he says, as well as any bogus pseudo-study. Or, when published data clearly contradicts what he has said, he invents threads of corruption to pretend the data is invalid. He just sculpts reality to be whatever he wants it to be in order for him to always be right, and the medical establishment always wrong. All he has to do is say government bad or pharma bad, and those who are susceptible to this rhetoric will swallow any ludicrous accusation he makes. Like that the government mandated COVID vaccines for the military in order to murder them, weed out free thinkers, and reduce military readiness, possibly having been paid off by China to do so. Yes, he actually said this.
Were interested in degrading military readiness, then the mandates might persist in the military while they are withdrawn in advance of midterm elections or something like that in the civilian population.
He has also claimed that the vaccines were a net negative for everyone and had zero efficacy, despite saving millions of lives. He claims the vaccines themselves created most of the COVID variants, something which doesn't even mean anything mechanistically, and of course the fabrication of all the deaths. He's brought this up on Rogan, and more recently with Tucker Carlson, he discusses the estimate by Dennis Rancourt, a full-on virus denier, of 17 million dead worldwide from the vaccine, and refers to it as careful analysis.
I saw a credible estimate of something like 17 million deaths globally from this technology. So
17 million deaths from the COVID vax?
Well, when you scale up to billions, it's not hard to reach a number like that with a technology this dangerous.
Unfortunately, with regards to COVID vaccines and the lie that they were excessively harmful and caused so many issues, we have gotten to a point where so many charlatans have repeated this lie over and over and over again that a huge proportion of the public are simply impenetrable. They absolutely can't be convinced that they were duped.
These folks are very comfortable at saying totally false things into a camera. It doesn't cause them to think twice or sweat or anything.
There were not substantially more adverse reactions to COVID vaccines, proportionally speaking, than any other vaccine that was ever this widely distributed. Nearly all of these claims of cardiac events and deaths were completely fabricated. But because of the relentless repetition from hucksters cashing in on the paranoia, it has become reality for millions of people, and rehabilitating the public on this issue is going to take decades. Let's hit one more talking point for Bret, which is without a doubt the most ridiculous of them all. As of late, Bret has gone on the record supporting HIV denialism. He thinks that AIDS is not caused by a virus. It's hard to decide whether this is more idiotic than it is downright offensive or vice versa, but let's hear his justification.
Was that actually the argument against HIV being causal was a lot higher quality than I had understood, right? That it being a real virus, a fellow traveler of a disease that was chemically triggered, that is at least a highly plausible hypothesis. And with Anthony Fauci playing his role, that was inconvenient for what he was trying to accomplish.
There's also ignoring a very important factor in AIDS, which is party drugs.
That is the competing hypothesis. And for those who think that this is a preposterous allegation, you should look at this evidence. The evidence is surprisingly compelling. And, if your mind resists that, realize that Luc Montagnier, who got a Nobel Prize for the discovery of HIV, later in life became convinced that the thing for which he got the Nobel Prize was not nearly as important as he had imagined.
That's right, party drugs, a thinly veiled reference towards the gay lifestyle. Great work, guys. By the way, Bret is constantly referencing Luc Montagnier, who got a Nobel simply for isolating HIV, and who subsequently became a full-fledged crank and a half, pushing bullshit like structured water, homeopathy, and other blatant pseudoscience. This is a fraud referencing another fraud to appear credible, nothing more. This AIDS denialism bullshit perfectly encapsulates the problem with Bret. Our understanding of HIV from the standpoint of virology is profound. We have an all-encompassing comprehension of the precise mechanism by which the virus infects T cells and damages the immune system. We have designed antiviral drugs which disrupt this mechanism to the point where we can now control the disease. Why do you think AIDS, while still serious, is no longer anywhere near as urgent an issue as it was a few decades ago? Because of the incredible science we've done to understand the virus and develop treatments for it. But all of this science is meaningless to Bret because he read some bullshit in a crappy book, or RFK Jr. said something stupid that he liked.
What Luc Montagnier had said, and I read Bobby Kennedy's book on Fauci.
Bret is nothing more than the clueless guy at the bar regurgitating the crap he fell for on Facebook. He just knows how to use fancy words to trick the listeners into thinking that he used some kind of scientific reasoning to reach these conclusions. It's a farce. To be clear, everything we've covered so far is just the tip of the iceberg. We could continue for hours and hours, as Bret's podcast is a treasure trove of paranoid insanity. Everyone is out to get him. Nobody can refute anything he says, and when people regularly refute everything he says, he just refuses to engage with them. This has happened countless times with science communicators confronting him on claims regarding vaccines, myocarditis, and so forth. He feigns openness and then runs away like a coward at every turn, just like Eric does, as we will see in a moment. But the way he postures as an expert in a field he has made no contribution to, continually downplaying, insulting, and running away from experts in that field, is nauseating. He is an absolute nobody, even in evolutionary biology, the field he studied, so on biomedical topics, he really is just totally clueless, which is why he hides from the backlash of his laughable and dangerous statements. Reality has caught up with him as of late, and he's quite a bit less influential than he was a couple years ago, which is why he continues to pivot to ridiculous topics that are even farther outside of his area of expertise, topics that just happen to fulfill the ultra-right-wing wish list. Here's a very recent interview. The obligatory wokeness rant, AI, UBI, Fauci, parenting, the dangers of pornography. And what's this? The inversion of the magnetic poles and disaster scenarios? He's pretending to understand geophysics now?
Tremendously vulnerable to the EMP effects that will come with a major solar impact. The North Pole isn't always where the North Pole currently is, and that sometimes these things flip. We are in the midst of what's called a polar excursion, and that pole flip threatens chaos.
Well, that all sounds pretty familiar. Where have I heard that before? Oh right, Ben Davidson, the scientist cosplayer, con man, and cult leader of Suspicious Observers, who I exposed the hell out of a few years back. Do you think Bret is a fan of Ben's?
Ben, I've been following you for quite some time, and I'm very pleased to finally be sitting down with you. And I'm also thrilled that you would join me for this when there's so much going on. So welcome to Dark Horse.
It would appear so. I wonder if Bret will make it out to Ben's apocalypse camp anytime soon. If you haven't seen me expose this clown, definitely give that video a watch, as it's some of my finest work. In the meantime, just marvel about the fact that there are people who can't tell that Ben's a complete psychopath just by looking directly in his eyes for 3 seconds. He is the stuff of nightmares. Anyway, that's a quick introduction to everything that's wrong with Bret Weinstein. Now we're going to pivot over to big boy Eric, but first I have to tell you about a very important application. We all want a reliable method of finding accurate information on the internet, especially when it comes to science. Google searches turn up a combination of fact and SEO-driven fiction, leaving us with more questions than answers. Direct scientific literature searches with Google Scholar or PubMed connect you to research papers, but they can be very hard to read, with many behind a paywall. Thus enters Consensus. Consensus is a new wave academic search engine that leverages AI and vector search to find and synthesize the best science for you. Consensus searches across 200 million scientific papers from the highest quality journals and presents referenced information to you in easily digestible fashion. Just ask it any question, like, oh, I don't know, does ivermectin cure COVID-19? Well, look at that. The science has spoken, a resounding no. Somebody should tell Bret Weinstein. But that's not the end of the investigation. Consensus pulls up the literature that is most relevant to the question, extracts key insights from each paper, and gives you a study snapshot, which summarizes experimental data, methodology, and relevant outcomes. You can do this with any question you have. You don't even need to know the precise keywords because of how vector searches work. Just talk to it like it's your friend. And you can even give specific instructions for how you would like your answers to be provided for you. Give it specific prompts combined with your search. Ask for the mechanisms of action, or how two concepts correlate with each other, or to explain a topic in simple language. Whatever you need in truly any area of academic study, from economics to anthropology. Is the gut microbiome linked to depression? What's the best treatment for acne? How does a cricket chirp? Whether you're a PhD candidate in theoretical physics or just a curious Jack or Jill trying to make sense of today's news, Consensus is for you. Join over 2 million people who have already switched to smarter, faster, and more reliable information sourcing. Try Consensus for free. No credit card, no forms. Go to consensus.app/search and jump straight into your first search today. Now back to the debunking. Eric Weinstein rode the coattails of his little brother during Bret's rise to fame from the Evergreen incident, using it as an opportunity to shoehorn his face into the broader conversation, having his voice then amplified by, who the hell else, Joe Rogan. And boy does he have a lot to say. Just look at the thumbnails for some of these conversations. This is why war and conflict is rising. We are losing control. Break free from the matrix. Eric is such a wise Renaissance man and elder statesman, isn't he? Look at this one. He says we need a scientific revolution. That's pretty hilarious, coming from a guy who has never made any meaningful contribution to science. You see, much like Bret, Eric has a doctorate, his being in mathematical physics, but he was never a scientist. Bret managed to publish 2 papers and then taught biology for a while. Eric has published nothing scientific whatsoever and has never worked with physics in any capacity. He's famous exclusively for saying things to sound smart on podcasts. Much like Bret, he spews paranoid, conspiratorial, anti-establishment tripe, and complains about being overlooked by academia despite never having done anything worthy of being recognized. Of course, he continually pretends he has done something worthy of being recognized. Something revolutionary, in fact. He says he has a theory of everything, which he calls geometric unity. He first unveiled this theory when he was invited by an old grad school buddy to give a public talk at Oxford in 2013. He didn't attempt to publish anything about it, and then began complaining about how scientists wouldn't review it or take it seriously, as those scientists are in the habit of watching 2-hour-long YouTube videos instead of reading papers. When pressed as to why he refused to publish a paper about his work, he always gave one of several mutually exclusive reasons. If he published, people would steal his ideas. He can't publish because Archive only accepts academic email addresses and he doesn't have one. Academia doesn't deserve his amazing ideas. He doesn't need to publish anything. The lecture was recorded and people can just watch the video. Not to have his rightful place as the next Einstein taken from him, Eric took to creating his own version of academia on Discord, a place where he could cultivate an inner circle of blind devotees. Soon he had a community with hundreds of members spreading his gospel all over the internet. Once this had some momentum, Eric eventually did finally put geometric unity into written form, releasing it on April Fool's Day 2021 with the disclaimer that he is not a physicist but rather a podcaster and it is merely a work of entertainment. If you ask him why he did this, he pretends that he did it to protect himself.
There are no protections inside of science for taking somebody else's work and putting another person's name on it.
And this was a good protection.
Well, yeah, and I put something saying that I choose to be an entertainer rather than a scientist, and therefore it has copyright protection.
This is insane. You can't just steal the published work of any scientist. That's called plagiarism. Publishing research in respected journals is how every single scientist in the world does science. This is just his attempt to play both sides so he can appear humble towards real scientists or just stay under their radar completely while appearing clever and resourceful towards his real audience, random people on the internet. His pseudo-paper is not intended for an academic audience at all. Why would he expect to be taken seriously by the scientific community when he is specifically telling everyone that he shouldn't be taken seriously? Indeed, nobody in the physics community cared at all or acknowledged him in the slightest, which Eric then pretended to be enraged about, like a little play for his fans. For years, he had been baselessly complaining about how string theory has a mafia-like stranglehold on funding in the field and aggressively shuts out alternative ideas, especially his, which is so revolutionary, he regularly claims, that it is the key to achieving faster-than-light travel and making us a space-colonizing multiplanetary species. Yeah.
Because you're saying we could get off this planet. What are you talking about in terms of the actual implementation of this theory of yours?
Despite his disclaimers, the dialogue Eric had been pretending to yearn for suddenly came. 2 people from within the Discord server, a mathematician and a physicist, decided to dig into Eric's work. They published a paper discrediting it more than a month before Eric even put out his pretend paper, based on the Oxford video. These 2 were Timothy Nguyen and someone going by the pseudonym Theo Pollia. Eric didn't like this one bit, as it ruined his whole facade, so he began to attack anyone who acknowledged this paper, accusing them of backstabbing him, and then eliminated his critics altogether by cutting the Discord in half, banning many members, and maintaining correspondence only with his remaining acolytes, thereby enacting the precise brand of suppression he falsely accuses academia of doing. You can see just how volatile Eric would get when pressed about this paper by listening to this conversation on Clubhouse. Somebody is asking when Eric will address the criticism head on, and this is how he decided to handle it.
When we'll hear like a debate with you and Theo and Timothy about
Sorry, who's Theo?
Timothy and Theo, they put out the retort to
Sorry, who's Theo?
Theo Polia and Timothy
Yeah,
Wynn.
I'm not aware of Theo Polia. Where did
We don't know who he is. Yeah, we have
who's
to know
Theo
who he
Polia?
is.
Do you know who Timothy Wynn is?
Let's talk about Theo Polia. Who's Theo Polia?
He's the co-author from the paper.
Who is
with
he?
Timothy Wynn.
Yeah, who is he? I don't know.
That wasn't the question, though,
No,
right?
that is the question.
No, the question was.
No, that is the question. No,
You
you're not
can't just-
understanding.
you can't
No,
just
you're not
bully me
understanding me.
into
I've never
submission
heard in
there.
the history of physics anybody expecting to be taken seriously as an anonymous critic.
As you can see, Eric fixates on the identity of Theopolia, cutting off the person speaking repeatedly as a way of derailing the conversation. It's irrelevant who Theo is. If there is substance to the criticism, it doesn't matter who is providing it, just like his insistence that it doesn't matter that his grand theory is coming from someone totally outside of academia. Eric should engage with the criticism, especially since the other author is not anonymous. Tim Wynn is a mathematician with a doctorate in gauge theory, the exact same field as Eric, and he is desperately hiding from this fact. Apart from flat out muting the person asking him about this paper, he pulls out every other excuse in the book to run away from it, from pretending it doesn't exist to making up stories about the authors being internet trolls who harassed his family and everything else imaginable.
Behavior of those gentlemen, however many there are, 2 or more, including various misogynistic comments against my colleagues, disrespecting Sabina Hassenfelder, who, while she may be a critic, is also a friend of mine. I'm fucking sick of these 2 people, assuming it is 2 people. Maybe it's... So we don't know what Theopolia is.
Great.
So sorry.
I mean, characters
No.
aside, so there is a paper that was put out rebutting geometric unity, right?
No, there wasn't a paper that was put out rebutting geometric unity. There was an attempt to publish something on the archive, which was rejected, that attempted to get in front of the draft that I put out, specifically looking at the text messages that were found on the server that supports these people to, quote, make me cry, close quote. Talking about is a phenomenon where people are trying to exploit a situation in order to make a name for themselves. And you'll notice that many people from that Discord server are trying to get people like you to react to me to name these names.
No, because
you're not. I'm going to mute you if you don't keep it up. All right, you're muted now. I think you're not understanding what I'm saying. And we don't allow people in general to go around making a name for themselves by being obnoxious, misogynistic, manipulative. It's fucking enough. You know, the archive meets 4chan.
He calls them Archive meets 4chan, as though he isn't dealing with academics far more credentialed than himself. And when the caller tries again to speak up and point this out, Eric says he has to go walk his dog.
May I jump real quick, please?
Actually, I'm kind of irritated. Like,
right.
I'm here
I
on
understand.
stage with people. Yeah, but like, I don't want to be subjected to this.
Okay, can I just say a couple of things really fast, though, please?
Yeah, but I'm about to go walk my dog, so...
The caller persists, continually saying it's about the math, and Eric just obfuscates every time. Misogyny, rape jokes, fixating on random people from Discord as a transparent way of evading the real criticism from real experts in the field.
And I'm not saying that it's them in particular. I don't care
Who's
about these
Theopolia? No, you're not understanding me yet. I'm not putting up with misogyny.
I'm talking about the
And
math,
I'm not
Eric.
putting up, and I'm not putting up with threats against my family. And I'm not
You
putting up
shouldn't.
with any of the stupid shit that server engages in. Capiche?
Great.
Am I
I
clear?
agree, Eric. I'm talking strictly about the
No, I'm
mathematics.
talking strictly, and I said something to you. Rape jokes aren't funny. Are we clear?
Who thinks they're funny? I agree.
That server.
He tweeted endlessly about this for months, all as a method of distraction so he could ignore his critics. Then his buddy Brian Keating comes to the rescue, saying this room is for physics, not petty squabbles.
Yeah, in the mountains. Yeah, actually, the title of the room is "Let's Talk About Physics." So I really want to stick to physics, and I want to make sure that we do have enough time to get to questions about physics. So let's move into that domain and stop talking about squabbles and so forth.
Of course, this person was trying to get more insight on Eric's physics, so it's just transparent redirection on Eric's behalf. Brian even spinelessly defends Eric's assertion that criticism is invalid when it comes from an anonymous source, and just generally shifts discussion away from pressing Eric to acknowledge the paper that invalidates his work. In fact, it's worth taking a brief aside to mention that Brian is something of a joke himself. He gets points for being an actual working scientist, and he has debunked some pseudoscience, but he's been desperately trying to join the ranks of the intellectual dark web for quite some time, promoting Eric every chance he gets, and he is endlessly sympathetic to certain types of anti-science propaganda, especially Discovery Institute, who he is always charitable towards, promoting them and leaving favorable comments on their videos, even very recently. I would bet he received some kind of compensation from them, and he even deleted a conversation he had with me on his podcast, presumably because I shat all over the DI in it. All of this apart from writing an entire book whining about a Nobel Prize he didn't get and never deserved. Long story short, Brian should not be taken seriously. Now back to Eric. So let's get down to brass tacks. What is geometric unity all about, and why does nobody in physics care about it? Admittedly, the specifics of this are beyond my pay grade. Fortunately, we have none other than Tim Nguyen himself to walk us through the nitty-gritty. To offer some preemptive context, many of the early objections had centered around how it's not actually a complete theory, it's all centered around something called the Cheab operator, which he does not rigorously define, claiming that it was written on his notes in college, and he's pretty sure it worked, but now he can't remember it. It does not incorporate quantum theory, which any theory of everything would absolutely have to do. It is mathematically inconsistent, and there are numerous other glaring omissions that make his work both incomplete and invalid. But let's hear all this from Tim. Tim, thanks so much for joining us. We're ready to take a little bit of an in-depth look at geometric unity, so take it away.
Great. Yeah, glad to be here, Dave. What I have here on the whiteboard is a display of the two papers in question. There's Eric's paper on the left, his geometric unity paper that he released on April 1st of 2021. And then there's my response paper, which I wrote with Theopolia, my anonymous co-author, back in 2021. It predates the geometric unity paper because it was based on his lecture that was on YouTube that was recorded in 2013. Nevertheless, it contained all the essential details, but just for the sake of history, that was what the material that the response paper was based upon. Anyways, let's just go ahead and dive in with that context. Before I go into the details, let me first just give a quick overview of what a theory of everything is, because remember, Eric's theory claims to be a theory of everything, so I thought I should at least clarify what exactly that means before I show what's wrong with it. So very quick crash course here. So let's recall that in physics, we have four forces in nature. We have the electromagnetic force, the weak, the strong, and also gravity. So I've written these four forces over here. And what does it mean to be a theory of everything? Well, you want to be able to unify all these forces. And unfortunately, right now, that's not the case. Right now, we have a unification of the first three, electromagnetism, weak, and strong. And those are unified in what's called the standard model. That's what's here on the left. And the standard model is quite intricate. It has all these particles, which you can see there on display. But famously, it doesn't include gravity. And so part of the problem is finding a model that would incorporate all four. And the other piece of the puzzle is that you also have to include quantum theory. And that's also very difficult. The standard model is a quantum field theory, so we don't have a problem there. But unfortunately, we don't know how to combine gravitation with quantum theory. Gravity right now is described by Einstein's general relativity, which is the classical theory, but we don't know how to combine it with quantum theory. So we don't even have a satisfactory quantum theory of gravity. So solving that and combining it with the three other forces is going to be very difficult. But that's just to illustrate the challenge.
Just to clarify for the viewer, right? When we're talking about combining these, like for example, electromagnetism and the weak force, right? They have electroweak, and then they predicted particles, and they went to the particle accelerator and found, what was it, the W and Z bosons and stuff. So it's not like just, oh, I think, it's not like a flight of fancy, right? We're talking about actual real empirical science unifying these forces to get closer and closer to like earliest epochs of the universe, like that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, of course, the standard model is one of these very well tested and validated models. Of course, it's not complete. There are still some mysteries. It doesn't include, dark matter and things like that. But it's been empirically validated.
We're trying to extend what we have with these three to that last fourth one, basically.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so right now we have sort of two separate theories or models, let's say, which is the standard model and Einstein's general relativity. And the standard model is already a quantum field theory, but general relativity is not. So that's sort of the lay of the land.
Yeah.
Yep. And maybe just one last ingredient, which is that the standard model is what's called a gauge theory. Gauge theory basically means there's a gauge group lurking in the background, and a gauge group is a symmetry group. And in physics, symmetry is very important. And it basically, in this case, describes how the internal states of particles have certain symmetries. And so that's just a very kind of important mathematical aspect of these theories. And that's why you have a gauge theory, because these particles have symmetries. And so, Eric and myself, we're both trained as mathematical gauge theorists. And so, this is how the gauge theory occurs in the physics, because the standard model is itself a gauge theory.
Got it.
Yep. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive right in. We have, in my paper, stated 4 objections to Eric's theory. So Eric's theory claims to be a theory of everything, and it's also a gauge theory. So that's how it relates to the previous slide. But I'll just go ahead and quickly state what the objections are. The first objection, in some sense the most fatal, as it were, is that there is no Shiab operator. So in Eric's work, he introduces this Shiab operator, and Shiab is an acronym for ship in a bottle. And it's an operator that appears in his equations of motion. So in physics, we have equations of motions. Like in high school physics, you studied Newton's laws, and the second law is the statement that F equals ma. That's an equation of motion, right? And as you progress through physics, you have more and more sophisticated equations of motions. And this Shiab operator is the one that occurs in Eric's work. And the objection here is that, Eric claims that there is this Shiab operator, and I was able to show that the definition he tried to invoke to show that there exists doesn't hold. So basically, he can't construct this operator. If you can't construct the operator, then your equations of motion don't make any sense. And so basically, his whole theory collapses because he just doesn't even have this equation, right?
It's just a magical thing that he's referencing.
Right, exactly.
That isn't actually real. Got it.
That's right. Yeah, and if for those who want to go into more mathematical detail, I have this long 2-hour lecture on the Eigenbros podcast, which you can find on YouTube, where I go into pretty concrete detail.
Yes, I'll definitely link to that. Yeah, I'll let everyone know.
Yeah, and it's actually quite well. I made it concrete in that I explain the essential details of why this fails in terms of 2x2 matrices. So there's a simplification in terms of that. So if people can understand 2x2 matrices, then maybe they'll appreciate the lecture. Anyways, so that's that. Okay, so objection 2 is that there is a gauge anomaly. So when we quantize the theory, that is when we take a theory that's classical and try to convert it to a quantum theory, that's what quantizing means, we have to show that certain anomalies vanish. Okay, so that's that's just something you, well, typically want to show that these things called anomalies vanish. And in the case of a gauge anomaly, the reason you want the gauge anomaly to vanish is that if it doesn't, then you lose gauge invariance, the symmetry that I said was very important. Okay, and well, what we show in our paper is that GU has a gauge anomaly due to the choice of gauge group that Eric makes, and that leads him into this fatal situation where you have this non-vanishing gauge anomaly, and so you don't have a quantum theory. So that's the second objection that we have. The third objection that we have goes under the heading of dimensionality and supersymmetry constraints. And the way you can think of that is that GU specifies incompatible structures. Okay, so Eric's theory lives in a 14-dimensional space. He claims to have various supersymmetric extensions. So supersymmetry is this extra structure you can have that relates fermions and bosons. It's quite intricate. But anyways, at a high level, when you specify these structures, you have to have certain particles. You also have to have an infinite dimensional gauge group in this case. And all of these extra structures are contrary to what Eric set out in his work. So basically, he sets up structures that are not compatible. And that's the third objection that we have. And finally, there are numerous omissions in the work. That was already evident in the lecture itself. And well, the unfortunate thing is that in the write-up that he had, he makes it also very evident that there are lots of missing details. Here are just two representative quotes that you can find in his work, and I highlighted the parts where he blatantly admits that he doesn't have the notes anymore for the claims claims that he's made.
I thought of it, but I forgot. But it totally worked. Trust me, bro.
Yeah, exactly. So going around asking everyone to follow his work, but then finally, when asked to provide concrete details, he can't provide them. Right. So quite unfortunate. Okay, so that's the gist of our rebuttal for geometric unity.
Awesome. Cool. So to summarize, would we say that it is doesn't qualify as a theory, or it does but is merely unsubstantive, or would we say it is flat out wrong, or all of the above? How would we, in a sentence, qualify this?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically not even competent work, right? I mean, his GU paper is 69 pages. There are lots of constructions and mathematical fragments, but because there are so many missing details and because of the problems that I already elucidated, it's hard to see what value there really is. It's just a very incomplete work, to say the least.
Perhaps we'll call it whimsy based on mathematical competence. Something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you for that. That is definitely an eye-opener. Well, there you have it. GU is junk. This is the primary lens with which we can view Eric Weinstein. He wants to be the next Einstein. Despite the similar last name, he isn't. But to him, it's enough to be perceived as such by the public. So what does he do? He avoids publishing anything for a decade to shield himself from criticism. He knew it would never pass peer review, so he simply attacks the concept of peer review every chance he gets. When he eventually does put something out after immense pressure and legitimate criticism is immediately provided, he ignores it, lashing out at anyone who mentions it, inventing elaborate narratives of harassment and unsavory behavior, as though that would invalidate the math even if it were true. Eric knows his reputation can't rely on GU alone, so he frequently props himself up as an internet guru, making bullshit claims about having predicted important events and technologies. He wrote a short blog post in 2010 called "Go Virtual, Young Man," which can be summarized as "The internet is cool." He references this blog post to pretend he predicted any number of things, like cryptocurrency, without any basis whatsoever. He wrote a run-of-the-mill finance paper in 2002 and uses it to pretend that he predicted the 2008 crash. It's all smoke and mirrors. Because Eric can't bear to face a reality where he isn't actually the world's premier intellectual, but rather just some guy with a doctorate and a decent intellect, he regularly resorts to paranoia and conspiracy. Here he is talking about the government being out to get him.
You know that the first person outside of me to get a look at geometric unity was Jeffrey Epstein. How did he know I was working on this? I don't know. I wasn't really talking about this stuff until, even my close friends didn't really know what I was up to. It's really weird when the government is actually out to get you, when they actually send a spy, when they actually engage in disinformation campaigns, when they smear you. I'll tell you why I built my channel.
The freedom.
It's going to be a lot harder to roll me this time in an alley.
Yeah.
I got rolled multiple times. And my point is, I didn't want to become a celebrity. I didn't want to become well known. But it's a lot harder to roll somebody who's getting, I don't know if this is mistaken, but I think I'm the math PhD with the largest number of followers on Twitter. Assume that I get banned on social media because somebody wants to make sure that my message doesn't interfere with the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
My favorite is the part where he claims he never sought fame, when that's literally the only thing he's ever really sought. That's why he goes on podcasts instead of doing physics. That's why he puts more effort into crafting his persona and fabricating aspects of his origin story than actually doing anything productive. He makes claims that the FBI has followed his family. He makes up stories about Jeffrey Epstein. Here he is on Rogan complaining about Harvard burying his work.
Harvard University told me to remain in good standing in this program, you cannot live in Massachusetts. Harvard has a program for how it gets rid of people it wants to get rid of who are in good standing.
It makes them move.
It makes them move so that they can't complete their thesis. I had effectively gotten on the wrong side. I'd proposed some equations that I was told were insufficiently nonlinear, never mind what that means. The story of a guy who was not allowed to attend his own thesis defense. To any academician, you hear it like, what do you mean you weren't allowed to? You present your thesis. No. I was not allowed in the room of my own thesis defense.
So this is why Harvard wanted you to move out of state.
Another victim of evil academia, just like baby brother Bret. The claims here are endless. He says that he was prevented from presenting his own thesis defense, something never done in the history of the world, when in reality it was just reviewed as a committee, the usual practice of the Harvard math department. This paranoia extends to his wife, Pia Milani, as well. Eric co-wrote 2 chapters of Pia's doctoral thesis in economics by essentially just applying gauge theory to a problem in economics, thereby re-deriving an inflation index that already exists. He routinely refers to this work as revolutionary, even though absolutely nobody cares about it, which is confirmed by the practically non-existent citations.
Pia Milani's thesis revolutionized all of economic theory, and it hasn't been understood. If you want to do something revolutionary, I promise you that it's an arbitrage. I can share it with the world. Nobody will do anything with it because the world decided to stand in the way of that progress. That's an incontrovertible fact to me.
Fortunately, our friend Tim has debunked this claim as well, so why don't we check in with him for another tidy refutation of Eric's inflated claims. Okay, so we're back with Tim, and now let's take a look at some of this economics work as well. Take it away again, Tim.
So also in 2021, Eric went out on a limb to promote his work on economics and gauge theory. That's sort of the short title here of this somewhat long title of this paper. He gave a talk at the University of Chicago in November of 2021, sort of under the same pretext as with his physics lecture. Basically, other scientists don't know what they're doing. If only they understood this gauge theory, yoga that I know and nobody else knows, they would have their eyes open to this revolution, right? And this work is also joint with his wife, Pia Milani, who wrote her dissertation back in '96 at Harvard, where she combined gauge theoretic ideas into her, her economics PhD, thinking about economic indices and inflation and all that. Anyway, so this is sort of like a reboot of that program. So in this case, he actually wrote a paper. And so I was able to actually write a proper response because there was actual paper this time rather than just a video. And this paper is now on the archive. And so people can also download it. And being on the archive makes it even more official. Yeah, because it was, the archive is moderated, and this paper did go through that moderation process.
Yeah, it's a legitimate source of information.
That's right. That's right. Okay. And in this case, it's also just by me. There's no anonymous co-author. Okay. Anyways, so let me kind of also just kind of summarize some of the problems with Eric and his wife's work. So let me just start off real basic, which is that the work makes a lot of very simplistic assumptions, which is quite unfortunate if you're going to make this claim that it's going to revolutionize economics. And in this case, Eric went on Brian Keating's podcast and said that this work was the most important work in mathematical finance or economics in the last 25 to 50 years, right? So when you make so many simplifying assumptions, it kind of really dilutes that claim. And let me just give you one representative such assumption. So here on the right here, I have what's called an indifference curve. And that's a curve that economists use to describe what an agent, a person, might consider equivalent sets of goods, right? That's why they're indifferent to which they obtain. So in this case, if there's two goods, good one on the x-axis, say apples, and good two on the y-axis, say oranges, then maybe this point is 1, 1, and so that's a basket of one apple and one orange, and over here is maybe a quarter of an apple and 4 oranges. So maybe for this person, they value one apple and one orange the same way they would value a quarter of an apple and 4 oranges, right? And same with other points on this hyperbola. Okay. Anyways, so one of the things that Eric assumes in his paper is what's called completeness. So he assumes these indifference curves are complete, meaning that they can't just abruptly end. Okay, so these curves have to go off to infinity. And if you translate that directly into, what is this really saying? One of the consequences is that it's impossible to value 0 of a good, right? Because this curve shoots up to infinity. This hyperbola shoots up to infinity if you let, say, good 1 go to 0. Right. So I can't have a basket of I refuse to have 0 apples, right? If I have 0 apples, I have to have an infinite number of oranges to compensate, which is
also impossible.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Right. So maybe this is nice for mathematics, but somehow in real life that you're forbidden to have 0 of something, which seems a little bit drastic. Anyway, so that's just kind of one representative simplistic assumption. But okay, let's just roll with it. But anyways, I thought that this was sufficiently concrete that it would be good to at least have this example. So anyways, this slide is just a snapshot of these two conjectures that Eric has in his paper, and they're very technical, so we're not going to go and try to unpack them. But the point is that in my response, I show what's wrong with them essentially. So for example, this conjecture 1 here, what I show is that it's actually false, and it's false in a very simple way. Basically, he sets up all this structure, as you can see there from all the notation. And what I showed is basically the simplest thing you can write down, what's called the trivial, it's called the trivial connection. This thing in gauge theory, that satisfies his list of properties, right? So sort of like the simplest thing you can write down actually satisfies it. So it's kind of strange that he would state this conjecture if the simplest thing you can think of once you know the setup also satisfies it. So basically it's sort of obfuscation, right? And then the second thing that I have here, I show that it's a tautology, in that this conjecture basically says two things are equal, but how do I say it? If you know enough gauge theory, you'll see that they're equal, and he basically spent all this time setting up all this notation, obscuring the simple ideas. And so it's sort of all the work that goes into unpacking what he did. At the end of the day, once you actually unravel all the terms in the notation, the thing that he's actually claiming is essentially like a well-known fact. It's basically writing 1 + 1 = 2 in the most complicated way possible. Right?
Long-winded, superfluous, obscure verbiage from Eric Weinstein. I don't believe you.
Right. What a surprise, right? Yeah. So anyways, so that's basically the content of my paper.
Got it. So it sounds like you said November of 2021. It sounds like in the wake of geometric unity flopping completely, he said, why don't I pivot over to this new thing, and where economists don't know gauge theory, and I can see if I can trick them. pretty much. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, great, thank you. I think both of these segments are have been very elucidating. I will definitely encourage viewers to go check out your longer lectures on these topics if they want to get more into the nitty gritty of the math. But I think this is very helpful for the average viewer and is pretty self-explanatory.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Well, that was even worse than GU. How does Eric keep a straight face when he calls this work revolutionary? But not just revolutionary, he claims that it is Nobel worthy. That's right. According to Eric, he and his brother and his wife all deserve Nobels, but they'll never get them because of various big bad evil something or other. Pretty incredible coincidence, don't you think? In this case, according to Eric, his wife's Nobel-worthy work was suppressed by Harvard because it posed a threat to something called the Boskin Commission, which was conspiring to come up with a fake adjustment to the government's methodology for calculating the price index in order to subvert democracy and save money on Social Security payoffs against the will of the people.
Was that the Boskin Commission in 1996 tried to figure out how to cut Social Security and raise taxes without getting caught, because that's the third rail of politics. And what they said is, if we change the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, the way we measure inflation, because tax brackets are indexed and because entitlement payments for Social Security and Medicare are indexed, if we claim that inflation is overstated by 1.1 percentage points, we will gain $1 trillion in savings.
But that's not all. Apart from being suppressed, it was also stolen by physicist Juan Maldacena.
Juan Maldacena, you will find only one podcast that he's ever been on, and that is the Into the Impossible podcast. If you look up gauge theory and an intuitive way to understand gauge theory, something like that, you'll come up with this really brilliant economic analogy that sounds like, Eric is copied from Juan Maldacena. This is Eric's work. This gauge theory applied to economic transactions. Eric and Pia Milani. Yep, Pia Milani, of course.
Juan knew that he had gotten this. He knew about Pia Milani.
Funny how an idea can be both suppressed and plagiarized at the same time, huh? The old hide away, but also steal and show. Seems like the script of choice for both Weinstein boys. So to reiterate, Eric deserves the Nobel. His wife deserves the Nobel. Bret deserves the Nobel. Even Brian Keating deserves the Nobel. But all of them were horribly betrayed and shortchanged by evil academia because of blah, 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 shoot me in the face. This persecution complex is something that all false prophets have in common. If Eric's work was worth anything, professionals would care about it and expand upon it. So to undercut this obvious logic, he pretends he is being suppressed. He invents concepts and cute acronyms like the intellectual dark web and the distributed idea suppression complex to manufacture an identity of the brave truth teller fighting the establishment, the hero battling against dark forces, trying to neutralize his genius at every turn. He is nothing but a fame junkie spewing anti-establishment tropes the public wants to hear, manipulating a cabal of podcast hosts to promote himself and aid in suppressing any dissent from his dogma, ironically, the thing he pretends to criticize academia for. He really is no different from Terrence Howard in spirit. Both pretend to have revolutionized physics and see themselves as the most brilliant person alive. Eric may be closer to that than Terry, but they're both still completely full of shit. Eric is much more dangerous, though, because he has a better ability to appear credible, and thus his lies on topics relevant to the public gain more traction. Like Bret, he has a host of garbage takes on COVID and vaccines. He denies the genocide in Gaza, and his endless rhetoric railing against the university system, peer review, and established physics goes a long way in fostering anti-science sentiment. Is there anything Eric is actually good at? It seems like he's good with money. From 2013 to 2022, he was a managing director for Peter Thiel, which is not the same as a hedge fund manager and is more or less an empty title, but he had to have offered some kind of value to be on the payroll. Although perhaps even this is a facade? Perhaps his sole function for Thiel was being the internet bullshit artist that he is. Thiel is a highly prominent, insanely wealthy anarcho-capitalist who actively seeks to undermine established academic and federal institutions. Eric is someone who relentlessly manufactures uncertainty and instability in these institutions on social media. Is this what Eric was paid by Peter to do? Wage Peter's culture war while he sits in the shadows? Eric has the resume for the job. He does understand math and physics, which gives him the ability to describe standard graduate-level math and physics textbook information to sound intelligent, and then sprinkle in whatever anti-establishment rhetoric he desires to give the illusion of being a purveyor of hidden knowledge. This is genuinely all that Eric does. He's not an academic. He doesn't do research. He doesn't publish. He doesn't teach. He talks. And boy does he talk. He uses as many big words as possible, but says very little. He uses podcast appearances to explain concepts in as convoluted a way as humanly possible, appealing to props and analogies that make no sense whatsoever, and then pats himself on the back for his explanatory ability. He talks to Terrence Howard for 4 hours and fails to explain how Terry is wrong in a way that the listener can understand even a single time. This is the essence of Eric Weinstein. Circling back now to the brothers as a pair, they really do have a lot in common. They use the same general formula. Academia, bad. I got degrees from bad academia, but I am good. I'm a genius in my field, even though I don't actually do research or publish anything, having 0 accolades or respect among scientists in my field. But that's because they're jealous of my brilliance, so they try to suppress my work and also steal it, which are the precise opposite of each other. All the nothing I've done should have earned me a Nobel Prize, and if you disagree, you're just an establishment shill. Sadly, this formula does work on a lot of people. That's why figures like the Weinsteins become so popular. They trigger something psychologically in a certain type of person. There are those who are hostile towards knowledge and academic success, so seeing an allegedly knowledgeable person share their disdain for institutions of knowledge can feel validating. Whatever the case may be, there are a few obvious threads of logic that sorely need to weave their way into the collective consciousness, or we will forever be falling for frauds like these. First, when Weinstein-like figures present their narratives, they should be met with intense skepticism. It's not that nobody outside of academia could ever possibly contribute to scientific progress, but it is exceedingly rare in the 21st century, and almost every single such person who claims to have done so is full of shit. People outside of science who claim to have revolutionized science have a very bad track record of being lying, manipulative frauds. This goes even more so for those who spend most of their time amassing a following and talking on podcasts. They avoid engaging with researchers who they claim are their peers, and instead engage with the general public who have no shot in hell at understanding what they are talking about. This is the second point that must be understood. If you are not well versed in a particular academic subject, at least at the level of a bachelor's degree, you will not be equipped to gauge the veracity or the relevance of what these figures are talking about. This is by deliberate design. They will convince you that they are explaining it so masterfully that you are suddenly comprehending frontier theoretical physics as well as experts in the field. But you aren't. It's like pretending that you can suddenly know an entire foreign language from watching a 3-minute YouTube video. It just doesn't work that way. These figures say things they know that 99.9% of the people listening do not understand, and they say them with extreme confidence to project an air of legitimacy and intellectual superiority. This resonates with a large proportion of people, as ultimately we are all in a way still primitive primates roaming the savannah, looking for a strong leader to guide the tribe. We find peace and satisfaction in relinquishing our critical thinking skills and letting the strong, loud alpha male do our thinking for us. Demagogues and cult leaders are tapping directly into this phenomenon when they preach, so when they present their realities, be skeptical. Be skeptical of everything. It's okay to be skeptical of the government and of large corporations or anything else, but also be skeptical of individuals who present themselves as heroic whistleblowers and Luke Skywalkers. Governments can lie. Individuals can lie too, and the person or group that is contradicting well understood and well established science is far more likely to be the one who is lying. It's very easy to spin an anti-establishment narrative that sounds cohesive because people are primed to distrust institutions. Everyone needs to be similarly primed to distrust individuals who make these outlandish claims. Everyone in academia is corrupt? Really? Every last academic in the entire world? Or maybe the singular person spinning that narrative is a lying fraud shielding themselves from criticism by anyone with relevant expertise? Weigh for yourself what is more likely. It's almost always the latter, and these people must be exposed, such that they will stop defending them, stop amplifying their rhetoric, stop supporting them on Patreon, because only then will they slowly fade away. There are so many more figures like the Weinsteins that need to be similarly exposed, and perhaps I'll get around to a few of them. Perhaps I'll even circle back on these two, since there is so much that we didn't sufficiently expand upon in this video in the interest of time. But hopefully, for anyone who made it through this video, if you previously had a soft spot for either of these guys, that is now congealed into the appropriate sentiment, which is disgust and contempt. So that's it for the Weinstein brothers and their adorable Nobel aspirations. I'd been promising this one for a while, so let me know in the comments if you enjoyed it, and if there are other similar figures you think I should tackle next. I'll see you next time.